"You have no idea how much worse it could have been," my husband's lover exclaimed. "I used to think I had a good marriage, not perfect, but solid. We had been together for almost 10 years, built a life together, and shared the kind of inside jokes and routines that come from years of familiarity. I thought we were happy, at least I was. It started with little things, subtle changes that, at first, I wrote off as stress or routine fatigue. He started staying late at work more often, something that had never been an issue before. He was on his phone more, angling the screen away from me, clearing his notifications almost immediately. When I asked, he gave me vague answers, work stress, last-minute projects, things that sounded reasonable enough, but in my gut, I knew something was off. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being paranoid. After all, we had always trusted each other. I never felt the need to check his phone or question his whereabouts before. But once the doubt crept in, it was impossible to ignore. Then came the night everything changed. He had been distant all week, distracted and short with me. That night, he said he had a late meeting. It was almost midnight when he finally came home. I was still awake, pretending to read on the couch, but really, I was waiting, watching. He walked in, and I knew immediately. His shirt was wrinkled like someone had been gripping it. His hair was slightly messy, the way it gets when he runs his hands through it too many times. And then there was the smell, faint but unmistakable. Not mine. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach, but instead of confronting him, I did something I never thought I would do. I stayed quiet. I watched him. I let him dig his own grave. Over the next week, I played the role of the oblivious wife. I didn't accuse him, didn't demand answers. Instead, I observed. I started checking his location history, looking at credit card transactions. He was sloppy, too comfortable in his lies. He had no idea I was watching, and then I found the proof. A text message, one he had forgotten to delete in his rush. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the message made it clear. I miss you already. Can't wait to see you again. That was all I needed. I took screenshots, backed up his messages, and quietly started gathering evidence. If he was going to betray me, he wasn't going to get away with it easily. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal, smiling at him, kissing his cheek, acting like I wasn't burning with rage inside. I needed more, though, something undeniable, so I set a trap. That weekend, I told him I was visiting my sister for a few days. He barely looked up from his phone when I said it, just nodded and muttered, "Okay, drive safe." He didn't even ask for details, which told me everything I needed to know. I left as planned, but I didn't go far. I parked a few streets away and waited. It didn't take long. Less than an hour after I left, he was on the move. I followed him, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. He drove straight to her apartment. I watched from a distance as he walked inside like he had done it 100 times before, like it was normal, like it was his second home. I sat there for a long time staring at the building, trying to process what I had just seen. And then I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him yet, not until I had everything I needed to make sure he didn't walk away from this unscathed. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do. I knocked on her door. She answered after a few moments, looking surprised. She was younger than me, pretty, the kind of woman he used to say he wasn't attracted to. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Yeah, I think you already know who I am." She went still, her expression shifting from confusion to realization to something else. Guilt, maybe. But she didn't slam the door in my face. She didn't try to deny it. Instead, she stepped aside. "You should come in." I wasn't expecting that, but I did. Her apartment was small but nice. Lived in. There were little things that made my stomach turn. A jacket I recognized as his draped over a chair. A familiar cologne lingering in the air. She gestured for me to sit, but I didn't. I just folded my arms and waited. "I didn't know about you," she said finally. "Not at first." I raised an eyebrow. "But you do now." She flinched but nodded. "I found out a couple of months ago." "And you still kept seeing him?" She swallowed, looking away. "Yeah." I let that sit between us for a moment. I wasn't sure what I had expected coming here, but the reality of it still stung. I wasn't prepared for what she said next. "I almost ended it," she admitted. "A few weeks ago, but then something happened." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, and for the first time I saw something close to fear in her expression. "Look, I know you hate me, and you have every right to, but you need to know you have no idea how much worse this could have been." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" She glanced at the door like she was afraid someone might be listening. Then she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I thought I knew him. I really did. But then I started noticing things. Little things at first. Just like you probably did. And then, she trailed off, shaking her head. I stared at her, my heart pounding. And then what? She met my gaze, and what she said next changed everything. For a long moment I just stared at her, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, but not out of anger. It was something else. Something colder. A deep, unsettling feeling that whatever she was about to say wasn't just about an affair. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, like she was trying to decide where to start. At first, I thought he was just intense, she admitted. Passionate. But then I started noticing things that didn't add up. I forced myself to stay still, to listen, even though my mind was screaming at me to get up and walk out. Like what? I asked. She glanced toward the window as if she was checking to make sure we were alone. It was small things at first, she said, like how he always wanted to know exactly where I was, who I was with. He'd ask for pictures to prove I wasn't lying. I thought it was jealousy, maybe even insecurity. My stomach twisted. That wasn't insecurity, that was control. And if I was being honest with myself, I had seen glimpses of that before. She kept going. Then there were the mood swings. One minute, he'd be sweet, planning dates, buying me little gifts. The next, he'd go cold over something tiny. A missed call, a text I didn't answer fast enough. He'd go quiet for hours, then suddenly show up unannounced, acting like nothing happened. I knew that feeling all too well, walking on eggshells, never knowing what version of him you were going to get. I crossed my arms tightly. Did he ever hurt you? She hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Not physically, she said carefully, but he scared me sometimes. He had this way of looking at me when he was mad, like he was deciding something. Like he was weighing his options. A chill ran down my spine. I knew that look. I had seen it more than once over the years, usually in arguments when he didn't get his way. She bit her lip, then looked at me. Have you ever seen his other phone? I blinked. What? She nodded, confirming what I was afraid to admit. He has another phone, a second one he keeps hidden. He doesn't let anyone touch it. I found it once by accident, and when I asked about it, he lost it. Completely lost it. He wouldn't tell me why he had it, just that it wasn't my business. I felt sick. I had never seen a second phone, but that didn't mean anything. He was careful. He knew how to cover his tracks. But if he had another phone, it meant there were things he didn't want either of us to know. Did you ever get a look at it? I asked. She shook her head. No, but after that night, I started watching him more closely, and I realized I don't think we were the only ones. It took me a second to process what she was saying. My heart pounded in my chest. Are you saying there are others? She exhaled sharply. I don't know for sure, but I do know that sometimes, when he thought I was asleep, he would leave. He'd be gone for hours, and when he came back, he wouldn't talk about where he'd been. And I'm not talking about work trips or business meetings. These were random nights with no pattern, and he was always different when he came back. Restless, almost wired, like he was running on adrenaline. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I let it out in a slow, shaky exhale. Did you ever try to follow him? I asked, quietly. She looked away. Once, but I lost him. He knew I was behind him, and the way he reacted... She trailed off, her fingers twisting together. He called me, furious, said if I ever tried to track him again, he'd make me regret it. That sounded like him. That was the man I had seen glimpses of over the years, but had convinced myself wasn't real. I swallowed hard. Why are you telling me this? She met my eyes. Because I don't think you really know who he is. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the truth was, I wasn't so sure anymore. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. I've been trying to leave for weeks, she admitted. I tried breaking it off, but every time, something stopped me. He always had a way of pulling me back in, of making me second-guess myself. And when that didn't work, he got angry. I felt like I was in free fall. He threatened you? I whispered. Her expression darkened. Not directly, but he said things that made it clear what he was capable of. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. This wasn't just an affair. This was something deeper, something darker. Why now? I asked. Why tell me this now? Her lips pressed into a thin line. Because I don't think you have much time. My breath caught. What do you mean? She looked toward the window again, as if she could see him standing outside. I think he knows I've been pulling away. And if he knows that I told you anything... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. A cold realization settled over me. I had walked into this thinking I was confronting the woman who had ruined my marriage. Instead, I had walked into something much, much bigger. And the worst part? I had no idea how deep it really went. I left the cafe feeling like my world had just tilted on its axis. Everything she said replayed in my mind on a loop. The secret phone, the unexplained disappearances, the way he manipulated and controlled her. But it was her last warning that stuck with me the most. I don't think you have much time. I didn't go home right away. I needed space to think, to breathe. Instead, I sat in my car, staring at my phone, debating my next move. Calling him was out of the question. I wasn't ready to tip him off that I knew something, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing either. Finally, I decided to check something. She had said he left randomly at night, slipping away for hours with no explanation. I hadn't paid much attention before, but now I was wondering, how often had he really done that? I scrolled through my text history with him, looking at timestamps. Sure enough, there were plenty of times he had gone silent for hours, only to resurface later with some weak excuse. A late work call, drinks with a client, a midnight drive because he couldn't sleep. All things I had accepted at face value before. Now, it was clear I had been blind. I checked our shared bank statements next. My hands trembled as I scanned through transactions, my heart pounding harder with each unfamiliar charge. Hotels. Late-night gas station stops in towns I had never even heard of. Expensive dinners I had never eaten. There was a pattern, one I should have seen a long time ago. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that he had been lying to me for years, or the realization that I had let myself believe those lies. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. If what she said was true, he would leave at some point, and sure enough, just past midnight, he got up. I stayed perfectly still, listening as he moved around quietly. Then I heard the front door click shut. I threw the blankets off and rushed to the window, peeking out just in time to see his car backing out of the driveway. My heart pounded as I grabbed my keys. I knew this was reckless, dangerous even, but I had to know. I tailed him, keeping my distance. He drove with purpose, not like someone just going for a drive to clear their head. He knew exactly where he was going. I just didn't know if I was ready to find out where that was. After nearly an hour, he pulled off the main road, onto a dimly lit side street. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I slowed down, watching as he turned into a run-down motel parking lot. I parked a little ways down, trying to stay out of sight. He got out of the car, glancing around like he was making sure no one was watching. Then he walked up to one of the rooms and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. A man stood in the doorway, his face partially hidden in the shadows. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a thick build and an unsettling presence. My husband stepped inside without hesitation, and the door shut behind him. I didn't know what I had expected, but it wasn't this. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. What the hell was he doing? This wasn't just about cheating anymore. This was something else. Minutes ticked by. My nerves were shot. I debated leaving, pretending I had never seen this. But then the door opened again. My husband stepped out first, looking tense. The other man followed, handing him something small, too small for me to see clearly. Whatever it was, my husband pocketed it quickly before shaking the man's hand. Then they both glanced around, like they were checking to make sure no one was watching. I ducked lower, my pulse hammering. My husband walked back to his car, still oblivious to the fact that I was watching. I didn't move until he was back on the main road, heading home like nothing had happened. I sat there for a long time after he left, trying to process what I had just seen. This wasn't an affair. Or at least, that wasn't the main issue anymore. There was something bigger happening, something he had been hiding from me for years. And now that I knew even a fraction of it, I wasn't sure I was safe. By the time I got home, he was already in bed, breathing evenly like he had been asleep for hours. I knew better. I knew what he had really been doing, but I still couldn't bring myself to confront him. Not yet. Instead, I waited. I pretended everything was normal. If he suspected anything, he didn't show it. He kissed me goodbye in the morning, left for work like nothing had changed. The moment he was gone, I went into action. I searched our house for a second phone. I tore through drawers, checked inside coat pockets, even lifted the cushions on the couch. Nothing. I was about to give up when I checked the garage. His old gym bag was shoved into the corner, covered in dust. It had been there for months, maybe years. There was no reason for me to suspect anything, but on a hunch, I unzipped it. There it was. A cheap, prepaid phone, the kind you buy with cash. My hands shook as I turned it on. There was barely any battery left, but it powered up just enough for me to see the call log. Dozens of calls, numbers I didn't recognize. Some were local, some weren't. Then I checked the texts, and that's when I felt the floor drop out from under me. There weren't just messages to other women. There were messages that made my blood run cold. "It's done. No loose ends? I took care of it. Good. Make sure she doesn't ask questions." I dropped the phone like it had burned me. This wasn't an affair. This was something much, much worse, and I had just stumbled into the middle of it. I stared at the phone, my entire body frozen. My mind scrambled to make sense of the messages, but there was no way to spin them into something innocent. No loose ends? I took care of it. This wasn't an affair. This was something criminal, something dangerous. And I had been living next to it, sleeping next to it, for years without realizing it. I needed to be smart. My first instinct was to confront him, to throw the phone in his face and demand answers. But what if that pushed him over the edge? What if he realized I knew too much? His lover had warned me, you don't know how much worse it could have been. I hadn't understood it at the time, but now? Now I did. I needed help. I couldn't just sit on this information and hope for the best. I needed someone who could actually do something about it. But who? The police? What if he had connections? What if they didn't believe me? What if this ran deeper than just him? I grabbed my purse, stuffing the burner phone inside before heading to my car. I drove without a destination at first, just trying to put distance between myself and that house. My hands shook on the wheel, my mind racing through every possible scenario. I had to assume he'd notice the phone was missing. I had to assume he'd get suspicious. I had to act before he did. I ended up at a small law office in the next town over. Not the police, not some flashy private investigator. Just a lawyer, someone who could tell me what my options were. Someone who could guide me through this without tipping him off. The woman at the front desk looked up as I walked in, her face softening when she saw how pale I must have looked. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I need to speak with someone. It's urgent." I don't know if it was the desperation in my voice or the look in my eyes, but she nodded and disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, I was sitting across from a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a firm expression. His name was Mr. Gallagher. I didn't tell him everything, not at first. I just laid out the basics. My husband had been lying, sneaking out at night, keeping a second phone, that I had found messages that suggested something dangerous, that I didn't know if I was safe. He listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When I was done, he sat back in his chair, considering me. "If what you're saying is true, you need to be extremely careful. Do you have a safe place to go?" I shook my head. "I have family, but they'd ask too many questions, and if he finds out I left, I don't know what he'd do." He nodded. "The most important thing right now is gathering proof. If you can get hard evidence of any crimes, that changes everything. You also need to make sure someone else knows what's going on, someone you trust." I hesitated, then reached into my bag and pulled out the burner phone. "I found this in his gym bag. The messages. They sound like he's involved in something serious." He took the phone, scrolling through the texts. His face remained neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw. After a long moment, he looked up. "You need to get out of that house. Tonight." A cold wave of fear rushed through me. "You really think I'm in that much danger?" "I think you don't know what he's capable of," he said. "And if he finds out you've been digging into his secrets, I don't think you want to find out the hard way." I swallowed hard. "What do I do?" He slid a piece of paper across the desk. "There's a women's shelter a few towns over. They'll take you in without asking too many questions. It's not just for domestic violence. It's for any woman in immediate danger. Go there. Stay off social media. Use cash for everything." I stared at the paper. Running. Hiding. It felt so extreme, but what choice did I have? I left his office in a daze. My whole life had just unraveled, and now I was supposed to walk away from it entirely? My home? My belongings? My entire identity? But what was the alternative? I drove back to the house with a plan. I would pack a small bag, just essentials, nothing too obvious. I'd leave my phone behind, take cash, and get to the shelter before he even realized I was gone. But when I pulled into the driveway, his car was already there. My stomach dropped. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. I had counted on having more time. I sat in my car for a few seconds, trying to steady my breathing. I couldn't turn around now. It would look too suspicious. I had to go in. Act normal. I forced myself to walk inside. He was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his eyes immediately locking onto me. "Where were you?" I shrugged, setting my purse down. "Ran some errands." He didn't say anything for a moment, just studied me. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. The burner phone. Every muscle in my body went rigid. "Funny thing," he said, turning it over in his hands. "I went to grab something from the garage and noticed my bag was unzipped." His gaze lifted to mine, sharp and knowing. Care to explain why my phone was missing? My mind scrambled for an excuse, but nothing came. The air between us was thick with tension. Then he smiled, a slow, unsettling smile. "I think we need to have a talk," he said, stepping closer. Panic flared in my chest, but I kept my face neutral. If I showed fear, I was done. "Of course," I said, forcing a casual tone, "but first I need to grab something from the bedroom." He didn't move. "I'll come with you." My pulse pounded. Every instinct in me screamed that I needed to get out of there now. And then, like some kind of divine intervention, a car pulled into the driveway. Headlights flashed through the window. He stiffened. I peeked out, my heart nearly stopping when I saw Mr. Gallagher stepping out of the car. His eyes met mine through the window. "I called him," I said quickly, making my voice light, almost teasing. "Figured I should get some legal advice." My husband's face darkened, but before he could say anything there was a knock at the door. For the first time that night I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't alone in this, and no matter what happened next, I wasn't going down quietly.